Hey, good morning, Destiny Church family. It's Saturday. Looking forward to an awesome Sunday tomorrow. But today we're going to look at a parable that Jesus told found in Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 19. We've talked about this, that a parable is just an earthly story with a heavenly principle embedded in it. And so we're going to look at this. I'm not going to read the whole scripture to you, but we're going to pull out some things that we can see and learn from. So we see in this story, we have our tenant farmers. These tenant farmers that Jesus is talking about, they have this land and they're just using the land and they're farming the land, but then they're supposed to give a portion of their crops back to the owner. The owner sends up a servant to go collect that property, and they actually don't give it to him. They're like, no. And so basically what we see here is this story is Jesus is telling a story, and he's talking about the Jewish leaders, the priests at this time. They had land. They weren't even supposed to own land, but they owned land, and not only that, they weren't tithing on the land and what the profits of that land was giving them. And Jesus is calling them out on that. And so the story that we're looking at and the principle we're going to gather in this is that partial obedience is still disobedience. And that's something that we look at and we see in the scriptures, that God tells us that partial obedience is not obedience at all, but it's actually disobedience. We're called to be obedient wholly to Jesus. In fact, we look in James chapter 4, verses 17. It says, remember, it is a sin to know what you ought to do and then not do it. These Jewish priests knew that it was a sin to not tithe on what they were getting, let alone the fact that they weren't supposed to own land. But they knew it was a sin, but they continued to not obey. I think about it, most of us maybe have children. We think about this partial obedience. Maybe you tell your child to go clean their room. Well, Mom, I did this, or Dad, I did that. Well, it's still partial obedience. And how often do we do that as believers? We're partially obedient to what God has called us to do. And as a parent, we say, oh, our kids disobeyed us. But maybe we're disobeying what God's calling us to do. We're disobeying what we know is right for us to do in our lives. So the challenge I have for you today is just a simple but practical thing that we can look at in our lives. But where in my life, where in your life, have you been partially obedient to God? Maybe you've allowed, God, this is kind of scary. I'll do sort of that thing. Where have you allowed partial obedience to replace 100% obedience? Because partial obedience is still disobedience. Challenge today, so search your heart, search your life. Where have you been partially obedient to God and you need to surrender wholly to His will for your life?